Our next panelists have covered politics in Wisconsin for a combined several decades. Here to help us put these midterms in perspective with the past, Patrick Marley of the Washington Post, Jesse Apoyan, Capitol Bureau Chief at the Cap Times, and Scott Bauer of the Associated Press. Thanks for coming in.
You bet.
So, Jesse and Scott particularly, you have been on the campaign trail for I don't know how many stops at this point. You guys are in the thick of it. Jesse, any stories standing out to you, any lessons learned?
I think with Democrats kind of going into the headwinds, probably the best thing that could have happened for them was for former President Barack Obama to come to Milwaukee. He's done that toward the end of the cycle of the last, this is the third midterm election he's done this. In 2014, it didn't work out so well for Democrats. In 2018, it did. So we'll see if that's, enough to push him across the finish line. But it definitely was, I think, the most energized I'd seen those candidates and their supporters in a while.
Scott, what do you think? Sometimes, we have these former big names come in and doesn't always have the impact, as you mentioned, that, perhaps could be wished. Do you think this is what gets that Milwaukee turnout we need?
It won't hurt Democrats, certainly, right? But I think the thing that's striking to me about who's come in is more about who hasn't. We haven't seen President Biden and we haven't seen former President Trump. The two biggest names, arguably, on both sides. Obviously, Trump endorsed Tim Michels and did a rally for him in August right before the primary, but he has not been back, and he's not scheduled to be back. So that is interesting to me.
Patrick, you were most recently at the Journal-Sentinel. You've recently made the hop to the Washington Post, which is a bit of a different way to cover politics in Wisconsin. What's that been like?
Oh, well, you try to look for trends that are happening across the states, and there's a lot of similarities between these, the Senate race and the governor's race here. What I've been focusing on a lot is what kind of changes to election laws could be coming, and, the landscape will change a lot if Tim Michels wins the governor's race, just like if Kari Lake wins in Arizona.
Absolutely. Now, Patrick and Scott particularly, your roots in Wisconsin covering politics goes back quite a ways, back to the early thousands, even the Jim Doyle era, end of the Jim Doyle era, like we were just talking about a bit earlier in the special. What's the difference between now and then? And I know that's such a massive question, right? The way politics have changed.
I had more hair back then. Well, Patrick can speak to this too. Well, go ahead.
Well, one thing I'd say is there's a lot of parallels between the first half of Jim Doyle's first term, I guess all of his first term, and Tony Evers' term, because the Republicans controlled the legislature by very large margins back then as well. And Doyle, he was clashing constantly with Republican leaders. They did find occasions where they could forge ahead and maybe they made more deals. Now that doesn't seem to be in the offing. Like, politics has become so divided that the two sides hardly talk to each other. Also, I think Republican lawmakers were not as skilled at how they structured a budget, and so Doyle was able to make some very significant changes through budget vetoes to his advantage.
Yeah, I would agree. And, it's not like back then everybody got along and everything was great and perfect and all of that. It was certainly a bitter partisan environment, but it just wasn't as weaponized, I feel like, as it is now. And especially the past 4 years where compromise has been almost like a dirty word in the State House.
Absolutely. When putting this midterm in context with just even more recent previous midterms, Jesse, what do we take away from this? It always feels like we come to every race saying, oh, this is the most important, and then the next one is also the most important. What do you think?
Yeah, we have a lot of cliches that exist for a reason, right? It all comes down to turnout. We say that every year too, and it's always true. But yeah, what happens in this election will certainly shape, the political environment of the state for a long time to come. If Republicans do get a supermajority and Evers wins, or if Michels wins, either way, there's a lot more that they can do. We can see a lot more conservative policies coming through, as opposed to 4 more years of this kind of gridlock that we've been experiencing.
I referenced this at the top of the show, but we recently just passed the threshold of most expensive governor's race in Wisconsin in history. It feels like this record gets broken now every round, but this is $115 million. It's just a massive amount of money. Patrick, is this normal nationwide? Where do we compare with perhaps other governor races?
Well, I think every election cycle does break records. It's sort of like there's just regular inflation and then there's campaign inflation, and just more and more money gets pumped into the system. You're seeing this across the country in terms of massive amounts of spending. It does reach a saturation point. These ads have an effect. There's more micro-targeting, which is, you can get more bang for your buck when you're going on Facebook or Instagram or whatever. But, I think at a certain point people just get exhausted with getting hit all the time with this stuff. text messages.
We're hearing a lot of that exhaustion just from viewers in general. Scott, who are the big funders? Who's pouring the money in the campaign? How do we compare who's spending now versus, say, who was spending in 2018, 2016?
Yeah, I think you see a lot more of the dark money coming in, these groups that don't have to report, where the money's coming from. And so that's harder to track. People will see ads and they'll look like maybe they're coming from a campaign, but they're actually not. They're coming from one of these groups that are advocating for one side or the other. And the money is just, that 115 million isn't even complete. I mean, that was as of last week, and we still have, a massive amount coming in through the end here. So, the money is definitely coming from all quarters because our races are so close, right? And they're so consequential. So it's not a surprise that there's a ton of money being spent, but the dollar amount is shocking when you look at it.
I want to touch on a headline that just broke this week on Thursday, where we saw a high-up election official in Milwaukee now potentially may face charges after she's accused of sending military ballots to a Republican state official. Put this in context of what we may be facing in this election and post-election in terms of continued election doubt. Jesse, I'll start with you, but I want you all to weigh in.
Sure, and I think Patrick's been covering this maybe a little bit more closely than I have, but we're seeing doubts raised about the system by folks who are committing crimes to prove that those crimes can be committed. It's a little bit of a, circular logic kind of argument, but it doesn't help with confidence in the elections, and it's interesting to see this coming from someone who works for the Election Commission, because usually the answer from election officials is, come watch us, come see the process, see how things work, have faith in the system. So it's definitely significant to have that coming from within the system.
Yeah, this is the second time we've seen this sort of like testing of the system by someone who says that there are holes in the system. And I think what causes the concern of most election officials is that now people have these doubts when, it was a small number of ballots, it was immediately caught, and they got on top of it. But they fear that voters, many of whom are already inclined to think that our systems don't work, that they'll have even less faith in the systems we have.
Absolutely. Scott, in our last 30 seconds or so, how long do you think it would take to potentially get results in? And how many court cases might we be looking at?
Well, the Associated Press is collecting results from all 72 counties on Tuesday night. Milwaukee says they're going to have everything counted by 11 o'clock. So if that holds true, we should know by the end of the night where things stand. If it's too close to call, we may be, waiting even longer, but we'll see.
Absolutely. All right. Well, we have a long election night ahead of us, I know. Y'all going to get any sleep over the coming week?
Maybe after Tuesday. We'll see. Depends on how close
Then we get to cover the court cases.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
we do.
It doesn't end on Tuesday, that's for sure.
All right. Patrick, Jesse, Scott, thanks so much for coming in. Always great to hear all of your expertise. I appreciate it.
Thank you.